There you go. And welcome, Donovan, to this project. Thank you very much for participating. I'd like to start off with some background questions for context, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I'd like to start off by asking you, where were your parents born?
My father was born here in Montreal, and my mother was born in the United States, in Chicago.
Oh, okay. And where were you born?
Here in Montreal.
Okay. And where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
Most of it was here in Montreal, so we're talking about elementary, secondary, cégep. I went to both Concordia and McGill. I went to the Institut de Tourisme et Hôtellerie du Québec, but I did get my master's degree at the University of Calgary.
Okay, very good. And what is your current occupation and/or past occupations?
I'm currently a teacher at the English Montreal School Board, teaching English and sometimes history, although that's been very rare lately, and I could get into that later as to why. And I also run a company called Haunted Montreal, or Montréal Hanté.
Oh, really? I know. I'm well aware of that. Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
great. Yeah. So, so it's kind of a tourism ghost tour type of company, paranormal investigations, haunted pub crawls, and all that type of stuff. So, yeah, that's a lot of fun.
Good for you. And where do you live now?
I live in Montreal in the Village right now.
Okay, very good. Now we're going to kind of get into more of the meat of the matter, so to speak. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, what is, in your mind, the best thing about living in Quebec at the moment?
Well, I've always kind of thought that Montreal is really a world-class city. When I was young, I did travel the world, and I thought I'd settle down in Europe, but eventually I realized that I wanted to be here, and not just for my family and friends, but because I really love the city. I love it just combines everything: the geography of the river, the mountain, the historic architecture, the history of the place, the diversity, the many, many languages that are here. So these are the reasons why I really love the city here. And of course, Montreal isn't exactly the same thing as the province of Quebec. I think there's a bit of a split between the city and the rest of the province. And that's kind of unfortunate, but hopefully eventually the influence from the city will eventually spread throughout the province, so we can do away with things like systemic racism and whatnot.
Okay. Now, some people have found this difficult to do, and I empathize. I do myself sometimes, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Describe your relationship to Quebec at the moment in a single word.
Strained.
Okay, interesting. Now, where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
For me, it's geographical location. I tend to like living in the area like downtown, Plateau, Mont-Royal, Village, just kind of central areas, because I like walking to work. Where I teach, I can walk there in about 20 minutes. And then all of the different ghost tours I do, I can walk to those within probably half an hour, 45 minutes.
Okay. Now, the next question, again, some people have difficulty with the second part of this question. I'll explain that to you. In the second part of the question, I referred to the official definition of Quebec, and people ask me, well, who's making the official definition of Quebec? Now, it can be the government, it can be your peers, it can be from your past experience, whatever you deem to be the so-called official definition of Quebec. So I'll start from the top and ask you both questions. The first part is, how would you define being a Quebecer? And the second part is, do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Well, I think being a Quebecer under the law means you've been living here for a certain amount of time. I don't know what that amount is, 6 months, a year, something like that. So I believe that's the the real definition of what it means to be a Quebecer, same with any other province or territory. However, the government has often spun it in such a way that to be a real Quebecer, you have to be Québécois de souche. In other words, like a white descendant of the colonists of New France. And even someone who moves here from France today often isn't considered a Quebecer, even though, they speak perfect French, they're white. And yet, because they're not part of that ancient colonial project, they often feel like they don't fit in quite. So that's kind of strange.
Okay. Has your sense of identity as a Quebecer or Quebecois changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
That's a good question. I think it has changed somewhat. When I was young, my father was like, listen, you have an American passport because your mother's American. You're not even going to live here. This place is a waste of time. And so, we were very much encouraged to leave. Most of our family is gone. The only reason my father ended up back here was because he was a bit of a draft dodger. They wanted him to go to Vietnam. And so he returned to Canada along with my uncle. And so, pretty much this is how I was brought up, saying, get out of here. This place is no good for English speaking people, even though our roots are Irish and, we have, all sorts of family members buried up on the mountain and whatnot, and a long history that goes back hundreds of years. So that's kind of the sense I had when I was young. And, that's one of the reasons I went traveling. I went to look for other places that I thought might be better to live. But then eventually, I became kind of homesick. I wanted to come back. And so I returned and I thought, okay, I have to do my best to try to integrate into, the so-called Québécois society, which of course means speaking French more often and doing business in French and things like that. And so that's what I really did. My company's fully bilingual. I've often worked in French. So I guess you could say I sort of tried to fit in more, but there's been just so many obstacles over the years, unfortunately, that were negative and negative experiences in some cases involving the French language. And so it's kind of a constant struggle to sort of try to fit in without the whole de solitude thing going on, and the whole idea of like labeling me as like an Anglophone, which pretty much means like a British colonizer in the lingo, when I'm Irish and my ancestors were oppressed far, far worse than the French ever were. And so why isn't that considered? Why aren't the indigenous people considered? And so, there's this misconception. I've met a lot of Francophones who say, oh, well, we're so happy because we've decolonized, starting with the Quiet Revolution. And I say, no. I don't think you've decolonized. I think you've recolonized. And that's quite a different thing because we still have all of these colonial problems and they're not really being addressed very well. So, it's a big challenge for anyone who isn't Québécois de souche sort of feel that they belong here, because there's this constant messaging from the government, like the CAC, saying that we don't. So there we have it.
Okay. Well, you've answered part of the next question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. Okay. What do you find are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec?
Well, I think the inflexibility about this desire to protect the French language is a major problem. And 92% of Quebecers speak French, which I think is probably more than even France. And, at the same time, we've got, 12 indigenous languages on the verge of extinction. And then there's this new law saying immigrants have to master French within 6 months. I mean, I was born here. I went through the schooling to learn French. I work in French, and I still haven't mastered the language. It's not easy to master a language. So you can imagine someone who wasn't born here, who doesn't speak a word of French. Of course, they can't master the language within 6 months. It's impossible. And so these types of, kind of threats saying, you have to become French. And even if you make the best effort to do that, it's still not good enough. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest problems here about belonging.
Okay. In recent years, Quebec's Francophone majority has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support? And which of these concerns make you feel excluded or even targeted?
Well, I don't support any of these initiatives. I'm a big supporter of inclusion and diversity. And so, it's interesting. We have all these words like racism, sexism, homophobia, all these different types of discrimination, but there isn't really a word like that for language, which is interesting. So you might not be able to be a sexist because everyone's against that supposedly, but yeah, you could trash any other language except for French, no problem, and no one's going to bat an eyelash except for the person who's been victimized or excluded by that. And so I guess my biggest feeling of exclusion is that even every time I try to fit into a francophone milieu, with the exception of my own business. I have a lot of francophones I work with, and we're all kind of on the same page. But when I work with other places, I'll just give you an example. I went to the Institut de Tourisme et Hôtellerie du Québec to get my tour guiding license. And in Montreal, there is a law that says you're not allowed to give a guided tour without this license. And so I was actually harassed one day by a French tour guide in the Notre Dame Basilica, even though I'm a history teacher, and I was simply bringing my history students there. And she's like, "This is illegal." And I'm like, "It's illegal for a history teacher to give a field trip?" And so I looked into it, and she was correct. And I thought, that's crazy, And so I went to the school, I did the program. I was like the only Anglophone there. And, it was really, really backwards in so many ways, like no acknowledgement that we live on unceded Mohawk territory, no Mohawk vocabulary, nothing. And then you find out at the end that the organization, which is called the APGT, Association Professionnelle des Guides Touristiques, is 98% white in a city that's 34% visible minority and about 1% indigenous. You find out there isn't even one indigenous guide in the organization. And so, when I kind of blew the lid off of that, I was on their Facebook page, bringing up these questions, about truth and reconciliation. These older French guides started to complain about this and say, "Oh, you should be stripped of your license." And then I got blocked from it. And so I got it all over the media, and they didn't like that. And so they kicked me out of the organization. And it's just this type of petty, stupid nonsense that happens often in Francophone circles that would never happen in an Anglophone circle. And I think because of a cultural insecurity, it's this feeling that they're the ones who were colonized by the British, but overlooking the fact that they were the original colonizers. And for me, being of Irish roots, colonialism is bad no matter what. And so I don't support the French colonialism. I don't support the English colonialism or any other colonialism, or even this sort of neo-colonialism that we're going through nowadays.
Okay, well, again, you probably covered the next question, but again, I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
What is the biggest problem facing Quebec as a whole today, and how, in your mind, do you think it could be resolved?
Well, I think the biggest problem is, probably two things. One is this endless discourse about how French is, needs to be preserved, and it's kind of saying like, French is better than everything else. That was kind of the same thing as the original colonial project with the Notre Dame Society for the Conversion of the Savage Peoples of New France. It was actually called this, and no one seems to remember this, but like their goal was to convert every indigenous person to become a French Catholic. Today, it's pretty much the same project minus the Catholic. And so, it's just something that's not working, that discourse, in the age of globalization, inclusion, and diversity. And so that's one of the major problems. And of course, the second problem is that, The government very much pushes this discourse to this very day. Even like the liberal government, who's supposed to represent everyone, made a major gaffe by trying to insist that people go and do 3 French courses in French at a cégep or things like that. And then, don't get me wrong, I mean, I love the French language. I speak French, I think it's a great language. But I'm more comfortable speaking French in France than I am here, because in France they're going to be, c'est un Canadien, cool, and here they're going to be, c'est un anglophone, even if I'm speaking French. And so, it's not the best way to get someone enamored of a language. I mean, I have an American friend who speaks way better French than I do because she fell in love with this language and wanted to just lap it up. Whereas when I was young, it was kind of forced down my throat. I was kind of told by other Anglos, okay, there's this cultural war, there's the deux solitude. So it's just not a good way to foster inclusion and diversity and respect. And also, I should mention, truth and reconciliation is a huge issue. I mean, we are living on unceded indigenous lands here in Quebec. There's never been a treaty signed apart from things like the James Bay Treaty, which was really bullshit. I mean, they were basically giving them the same power of a municipality and then flooding their burial grounds and destroying their rivers. I mean, this isn't justice. We need to sit down and rethink this entire relationship. And I think the indigenous people should have at least 50% of the say in what goes on here, in the age of climate change and everything else. I mean, we're just going down the wrong path, and it's not good for anyone. It's not even good for the white majority pure laine, in my opinion. It just, keeps people fearful of otherness. It keeps people closed-minded, and it's just a bad situation all around for trying to have a cohesive and united society.
Okay, fair enough. Now I'm going to borrow a little bit from Guy Rogers' playbook here.
Okay.
He used this very effectively in his documentary. So I'm going to, in my next question, ask you to indulge me by a show of fingers on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. How strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
7.
Very good. All right, to wrap this up, is there anything else that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec that you haven't covered already?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I am a legally qualified history teacher. And I think one of the major problems is the way history is taught in Quebec. It's pretty much almost the same thing when I was in high school. They're saying, there's 3 indigenous groups, the Inuit, the Algonquins, and the Iroquois. And it's like, no, there's 12 indigenous nations here. They can't even get that right, That would be like me saying, oh yeah, in Europe, there's 3 groups. There's the Germanic language, the Latin languages, and the Celtic languages. It's like, why is it so diluted, And of course, there's nothing about indigenous worldview or any of that. And then the course is extremely racist. You've seen the reports, right? The MSB had experts study it, and they said this has to go in the garbage, And so when I taught it, I was trying to say, look, you have to pass this course, but it's not real history. I'm going to try to teach you both. And I teach adult ed. So these are people who are already struggling to complete high school. Now, this is a university level thing to ask them, to say look, you have to do this, but, let's look at it critically at the same time. And I even had one student who came in and she had done this course 7 times and failed every time. And she was Mohawk, And so I wondered, did she really fail because she doesn't understand history, or did she fail because she can't accept this bullshit, And so, I immediately passed her. After another exam, and she wanted to be a nurse. And I thought, why are they stopping this indigenous woman from becoming a nurse? because she doesn't accept this fake version of history, and so, eventually I stopped teaching history. I thought, I just can't do this anymore. It's not really fair to teach this course in the first place. It's not really fair to ask them to do critical analysis at the same time. And I just felt really torn about the whole thing. And so now I pretty much teach English, both academic, grades 7 through 11 and ESL. And so I put the history into those. And so there I can put in the real history and take them on field trips and, show them videos about truth and reconciliation and things like that. And so I think that's, another part of the problem is that, the government is trying to use history to push a nationalistic agenda. It's very biased, and it does exclude others. And of course, those who don't have critical thinking skills will just accept this at face value. Whereas those who do, like when I was in high school, I asked the history teacher, who said, well, we had to send them to schools because they were uncivilized, And I said, well, wait a minute, how come there's no Indigenous people in our class? How come I've never met an Indigenous person in my life? And so there were all these questions I was asking. And so I was a bit of a critical thinker, but, your average person might not be. And so I think that's a big part of the problem as well, is just the misteaching, the miseducation of history.
Okay, well, I'd like to end the official recording of this by thanking you for your participation and insight, which was truly fascinating. So I'm going to stop the recording here, but we can continue the conversation.
Okay.